Every time a new era of consoles arrives, game devs load up on making as many cool, next-generation defining experiences as possible. Unless you're the PS5, in which case you get nothing. And Demon's Souls Remake. Everyone remembers the big early releases like Super Mario 64, Bloodborne, the original Halo, but also sometimes publishers decide, hey, we need a little extra cash. Why risk only releasing God of War Ragnarok on the PS5 when we could also put it on the PS4? The cross-generation, sometimes last-gen port, a strategy that goes back basically as far as gaming. Be it an attempt to double dip a yearly release, or realizing that more people have a Wii than a Wii U with Rodea the Sky Soldier. I'm sure you've all heard of and played Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2, but have you tried the venerable Skater Man on the Game Boy Color? Yeah, despite coming out on the Game Boy Advance as well, Activision simply could not resist the smell of money coming from kids stuck with the older hardware, leading to this becoming reality. Poor grandma's gotta get something for little Timbo, but thankfully this can go either way. Some are terrible and others decent. So this video goes out to all those unfortunate internetless souls stuck on the 360 while their friends were celebrating with fancy X-Bones.
Stick with 360, that's your message if you don't, like it?
The last gen ports, the video games deemed as lesser than simply because they had lower resolution or completely lacking the Nemesis system. Bust out that dusty Wii U, I'm sure you all have. We're getting crunchy. So yo, it's Austin, and today we're gonna be diving into the lost era of the last generation port, something you might only experience on a Nintendo Switch these days. We've got a whole lot of last gen ports to talk about today, so let's keep an eye open. While we're at it, let's make it worldwide, because today's video has been sponsored by Gameloft and Carmen Sandiego. That's right, she's back, and this time we're taking the role of Carmen as we solve puzzles, mysteries, and various capers. Newer gamers out there might not know her, but Carmen Sandiego is actually one of the oldest gaming franchises out there. Originally created in 1985 by Broderbund. It was an educational game that had you scouring the planet for international thief Carmen Sandiego. Millions of kids, including myself, grew up playing this on old PCs and had theme song brainworms. It just creeps up on you. Well, she's back, and I think they did a good job capturing the spirit of the originals. Lots of hard thinking. There's a new narrative-driven campaign as well as the retro-inspired Acme files, where they literally recreate some of those older sprites as you track down the vile crime committers. It's Villains International League of Evil, by the way. The deluxe edition also lets you chase down Carmen herself. Also, shout out to Gameloft for sending me this gift box for the game. There's a lot of effort in here with the case files and postcards for the new show and game. There's a lot of variety when it comes to chasing down criminals, including, sky gliding, QTEs, classic 80s style puzzles, and having to use clues to figure it all out. But instead of having to write it all down, the clues are stored on the side of the screen. Though you might still have to Google words people don't use anymore, like toe-headed. Haven't heard that one. I guess it's still educational. Carmen Sandiego is a cool reboot of a classic concept that's fun for everyone, be they old fans or heck, even their kids. So if you're interested in this, you can pick it up today on all major consoles, PC. Click the link today. Thanks to Gameloft for the sponsor. But for now, we're gonna go back to a previous generation so we can look at some borked-ass versions of video games. Or in some cases, maybe a bit better. Considering we're already there, I think we might as well start with some classic licensed games. Licensed games and multi-plat ports coming out on everything under the sun are as common as The Rock making a comeback these days. It'll happen even if you don't want it to.
I want your soul.
It doesn't matter the genre, superheroes, anime, movies past their prime, it'll release on 9+ platforms, and I live for it. Especially the janky DS ports. Previously, we looked at X-Men Origins Wolverine, the caged edition on the PlayStation 2 and Wii, which is,
That hurt, bro?
bad. And we also can't forget the Fantastic Four Rise of Silver Surfer, which was somehow better than the next-gen counterpart. But like barely. However, none of those can beat Spider-Man, whose games have swung across several generations. Movies? You can bet on Spider-Man 2 being on the GBA and DS. Original story? Spider-Man vs. the Kingpins got you covered on both the Genesis and Master System, for better or worse. Today, however, we're looking at a cult classic, a game that came out in a weird period between the film franchises, Spider-Man Web of Shadows. If you've never played WAS, you should. It's one of the better Activision-era Spider-Man romps. It has this morality system that'll affect where the story goes, and it'll change which of Spidey's friends you can call in. You might recognize it from the sad walk meme, which, yeah, it's perfect. But it's also got the second best QTE failure in the entire series.
Gotcha.
Web of Shadows ain't the tightest of Spider-Man titles, but it makes up for it with a wild story and combat that's fun enough. A tight, almost 7 out of 10, I like it. However, I don't like the PlayStation 2 port. The Amazing Allies edition of Web of Shadows is a big old disappointment. Right off the bat, it's a 2D side-scroller, which isn't bad, but second off, they made the combat and the beat 'em up terrible. It's so rough it'll have you missing combos, causing them to come to a complete halt even though you're clearly smacking goons. That, and they made Peter way too hard to control. You're zipping around like a madman. Gone is the open-ended web swinging. In is miserable platforming. It just doesn't feel right. Web of Shadows' big thing was that morality system, but with some NPCs, you can actually reject quests, meaning you can skip a ton of content, meaning you'll lose the plot. Though you might want to, because I was falling asleep like 20 minutes into this. Would make sense to play this in bed though, considering this is just the PlayStation Portable version on the big screen. The animations look like it. At least there's some new content. The big boy version of Web of Shadows didn't have the ability to equip the Amazing Allies. That means you can summon people like Sandman and Galactus. Don't forget about Professor X. What in the world? You're gonna wanna spam these because the bosses are absurdly difficult, like Venom with his adrenaline momentum going off. Web of Shadows Amazing Allies ain't amazing. I'd much rather play Dynasty Warriors Gundam 2 now for a different kind of port. Web of Shadows is an entirely different game, but this is kind of the same. Japan tends to stick with older consoles a bit longer than Western publishers, so it's no surprise that this thing came out with the year 2009 on the box. I love me some Gundam, I love me some Dynasty Warriors, put them together and I'll stick around for way too long. This second entry promised more of the same, more robots, more destruction, more Kira crying. The PS triple flagship of this was solid. It had a mostly stable frame rate and it did its thing, the Dynasty Warriors thing. On the PS2, it's less good, but still Gundam. Take the enemies on screen and cut that in about half. It's got most of the content of the next gen ports, just without some of the pizzazz. Less voice acting, no online, no trophies, which for some will be a deal breaker. When it comes to last gen ports from this era, this is gonna be the most normal kind of take you'll see. The same game, just a little less. And don't worry, you don't need to get your vision checked. The split screen co-op really has that N64 fog. Ghostbusters, the complete opposite of mecha. Well, kinda, it's like a kaiju movie at times. This classic film became a franchise that Sony thinks needed a full universe with various shows, movies, and of course, games, none of which require a Crystal Head vodka purchase. Anyways, before all that, when the third movie was just in talks and kept falling through, an official game made its way to just about every platform you can imagine in 2009, when the franchise was super relevant.
Nice going.
And it's pretty solid. Simply Ghostbusters by Terminal Reality. People like this one. It incorporated elements from the canceled third movie script out of Raimi's and Aykroyd's drafts. It even got a remastered port a few years back. However, this is about ports, and this clearly wasn't gonna be running on the PlayStation 2 and Wii, so Atari hired Redfly Studio, had them tone everything down into a cartoon caricature, and what we got was Wii PS2 Busters, also PSP.
Would it kill him to mix in a green salad?
This one features a similar gameplay loop, however, they toss it up by completely changing level structures and even ghosts you'll encounter. Capping those ghosts requires you to match movements to suck them in as opposed to the drag and dropping from the PlayStation 3 release. It's also lacking the co-op multiplayer, which was a surprisingly fun horde mode. Not that you can even play that anymore. It's all offline and not even the remasters brought it back. A big shame. Wii PS2 Busters isn't a terrible port by any means. It's probably got a cult following too due to being a Wii title. The motion controls in that version really do capture the frantic feel of zapping ghosts while listening to a bunch of people yap and complain. Bonus points for its wacky art style. You know what you're getting into the second you lay eyes on the cover and see Dan's big ass chin.
Nice of you guys to join us. You grabbed the little spud?
Mashed potatoes now.
Finally, it ain't a licensed game section without a big one, Star Wars. Millions of games as far as the eye can see, but if you look real close, you'll see something edgy. A little closer. There it is, Star Wars The Force Unleashed, featuring everyone's favorite Soul Calibur 4 character, Starkiller. Looking at this, you know what generation we're in. We got buzz cuts, clips you could easily toss together with some corn. Basically, Darth Vader's dad simulator, which is also no longer canon. This game was great. The 360 and PS3 versions of it were pretty solid looking for the time. I loved playing as Vader to start it up, even if it made you feel a little bad. Although it'll never not be funny to use force powers to launch a stormtrooper into the abyss. Unfortunately, despite its technical fun and novel concepts, the next-gen version of this hasn't held up great. The destruction physics are nice, but there's not a Dynasty Warriors amount of enemies to play with, which brings me to the PlayStation 2 and Wii version of it. They might actually have a little more sauce. I might like them more. Developed by Chrome Studios, the people behind the cool, edgy Elijah Wood's Spyro trilogy, The Force Unleashed is a good time. The combat's a little more varied. The boss fights tend to have more depth in comparison to the HD ones, but I just generally like the pacing of it all more. There's a lot less running around in large empty spectacle rooms and more star killing, even if some of that is incredibly long QTE sequences that'll restart if you fail a single prompt. The story and cutscenes are all intact, even the cool transition with the eyes. This one's cool. And in a strange twist of events, this game, which was originally stuck on an old SD console, would get a port all the way in 2022 and only to the Switch. It's of the Wii version in particular, so they brought over the motion controls, the 2-player dual mode that wasn't in any other version, and unless you really want those HD edgelord textures, this might be the one I'd recommend. Then we got Star Wars The Force Unleashed for the Nintendo DS. I expected worse. This is a completely different game, which makes sense considering it's on the DS and there's 5 different SKUs for TFU. It's not bad, it's not great, definitely nostalgic and probably the next step for broody 10-year-olds after Shadow the Hedgehog. Damn. Speaking of, you'll see this a lot, like a whole lot. In fact, I might want to make a video about this specifically, but in the 2000s, it was super common for a bunch of releases of the same game to be totally different despite having the same exact box art. For example, Sonic Unleashed, a game we've covered to death in the past, but has had multiple versions that were completely different. One Sonic team, the other Dimps. They were decent alternatives and almost companions to the HD Bloom-heavy flagship Werehog, though with way less content, no hub worlds to explore, less music, and way less chili dog stages, though that might be okay. Sonic Unleashed is one of the most perfect examples of an entirely different last generation port. It's hardly a port, it's just a different game. You'll also see this a lot with good old James Bond 007. When Electronic Arts was holding on to the James Bond video game license, you'd be remiss to see a game not on every platform imaginable. Nightfire, one of my favorites, had a different PC port made by Gearbox on the Half-Life 1 engine. You ever play Everything or Nothing on the Game Boy Advance? How about the 2 totally different takes on The World Is Not Enough? Or, if we move over to one of the worst Bond films, and I'm not talking about Die Another Day, Quantum of Solace. The movie with a script that got hackneyed together a few hours before the writer's strike of '07. Quality ahead. Well, around the same time EA lost the Bond license, Activision picked it up and this would be their first published game. Simply Quantum of Solace. They went all out. Not 1, not 2, but 3 different versions of Danny Craig's self-described shit show. Acti saw the success the series had in the past, and for the big blockbuster, they were gonna let it rip across every platform. DS, PC, PS2, PS3, Wii, 360. Not the PSP though. And they did. With review scores not that far off from the film. The 7th gen versions of QoS, which included the Wii for once, can only be described as Call of Bond Quantum of War. The shooting, the explosions, the set pieces, all of it feels ripped straight out of Call of Duty, which I guess makes sense considering it was developed by Treyarch. Just add in the 3rd-person perspective when you go into cover so you can see Daniel Craig's perfectly sculpted PS3 face. It's beautiful. Also, don't forget some of the worst action choreography you'll ever see in a big AAA shooter. Flip over to the PlayStation 2 and you'll get, well, a James Bond game. This one's got all the stuff you'd expect from Bond post-GoldenEye, from tightly scripted chase sequences, big shootouts, to the stealth infiltration missions. Seriously, the only thing that's missing are driving sequences. Guess you gotta get 007 Racing for that. Don't though. Quantum of Solace for the PlayStation 2 is actually the highest reviewed one of these, which makes sense when you see that it was developed by Eurocom, who also created Nightfire and a slew of other bangers from this era, and also 007 Legends, but we're not gonna talk about that. This one sticks to the 3rd person the entire time, which works better than the janky swapping of perspectives on the big boy consoles, and also helps sell the idea that you're Bond. with his gorgeous PS2 face. Both versions of this game only loosely follow the story because it sucks, and instead leans more into Casino Royale for a majority of the levels. A couple of the layouts were changed, some were removed, but the PS2 version also has its own exclusives and perks. In a world where most James Bond video games are okay to good, Quantum of Solace PS2 is pretty okay. Bonus points for this run cycle. Look at him go. The Wii version of Solace was just a downscaled 360 port, which was not typically the case, which is also what happened with Dead Rising. Man, Dead Rising's a classic for a reason. There's a lot of fun to be had messing around in a mall, donning a surfbot head and fighting a Dynasty Warriors amount of zombies. This release was a technical showcase for the 360 when it came out in 2006, so when you tell me that Capcom was gonna be porting this to the Nintendo Wii, the console with a top resolution of 480p, I straight up didn't believe it. Enter Dead Rising Chop Till You Drop, the Wii exclusive port of Dead Rising. And it's fine. I don't think it could ever reach the heights of the HD version, but it's still got a lot of charm. It's just not fully unscathed. The in-game cinematics were swapped out for pre-rendered videos, which unfortunately means no more Frank looking super cool during cutscenes.
Is your ride reliable?
Absolutely. That's how I plan on getting out of here.
Sorry, I don't have time for poor people.
You lose the Dynasty Warriors 6 and are greeted with a Dynasty Warriors 2 amount of zombies on the screen. Real-time base scoops were replaced with a simple mission structure. A lot of the elements are simplified. That's just scratching the surface of changes though. I just wish they didn't remove the camera. Considering Frank West, a journalist who covered wars, you know, and defeated Dr. Doom, is thematically doing that in the original game, its removal takes out a ton of the charm. You'd think that the camera would be a shoo-in mechanic with the Wiimote, but I guess not. Look, I'm just saying it's crazy we didn't get this or Pokemon Snap on the Wii. It just made sense. Speaking of point and shooting, Chop Till You Drop was overhauled to focus on the guns versus the improvised melee weaponry. Parasols, shopping carts, and most melee weapons still exist, but you can only carry one at a time, meaning they really want you to point and click out the screen with the guns. Honestly, it just kind of feels like a mashup of the Resident Evil 4 Wii port and Dead Rising, and it's something that'll probably never get remade in any way, especially not with its new remaster. Dead Rising Chop Till You Drop may not be worth playing, but it is kind of a neat and cheap relic. Kind of like Ubisoft. Okay, maybe not neat, low-hanging fruit, but they do seem to be a relic of the past at this point. Ubisoft was no stranger to multi-generational ports on every console. Such was the case with Prince of Persia: The Forgotten Sands, a game with 4 completely different releases, the best being on the Wii. Same thing happened with Ghost Recon Advanced Warfighter. However, I gotta talk about Splinter Cell Double Agent. Now look, we've never talked about Splinter Cell on this channel, which sucks because some of these games are awesome. Chaos Theory and Pandora Tomorrow are 2 of the coolest stealth action games ever and perfect jumping off points for the genre. Now, Double Agent, it's okay. As per usual with Tom Clancy's Splinter Cell, you do a lot of sneaking around using tech to take out enemies, do a little hacking, and complete objectives. Typical Sam Fisher stuff. However, the 360 Double Agent takes on a lot of those early console technical woes. Grimy, shiny surfaces, frame rates that plummet, pop-ins, and well, it was pretty at the time. This lighting was so good back then, alright? They made a really weird choice to not include a HUD, which meant you were stuck looking at the color changing light on Sam's back to see if you were hidden or not. Kinda reminds me of Dead Space. I was never a fan of games trying the HUD-less approach, but luckily the port of this to the original Xbox did. Created by Ubisoft Montreal, the creators of the original Splinter Cell and Chaos Theory, this port might be better than the 360 one. Not that that's bad, it just doesn't have all of the sauce. The story is conveyed better, the mission directives make more sense. Heck, the level design is way tighter and there's lots of ways to do objectives. Like, look, it's just some good classic Splinter Cell. No fancy stuff. What do you want me to say? Strangely, while both takes on Double Agent have a similar beginning and middle, they start to deviate in the third mission, leading to a completely different ending. A lot of fans call the 360 release version 1, with the original Xbox port being V2, and this actually matters because the next sequel, Conviction, picks up from the 360 release. This is a rare case where the same game is worth playing 2 times due to the fact that they're both decent and different enough to warrant another go. Maybe one of these days Ubisoft will fill the Sam Fisher-shaped hole in all of our hearts, but I'm not counting on it. Maybe next time they'll put his iconic goggles on the cover instead of a big bald head walking away from explosions. Oh, look at this guy, he thinks he's so cool. Kinda is though. Next up, good ports, and honestly it's not that common. You see, big names coming to consoles with fraction of the power of their big boy counterparts, and most of the time it just doesn't work. However, sometimes with the right team you can pull it off. Such was the case with all the Wii versions of Call of Duty. I'm not sure why they targeted it for any other reason besides money, but Activision sure wanted to make Modern Warfare work on the Wii. And these weren't just simple ports either. They went full waggle, added some extra features, and made the generation's biggest first-person shooter franchise available in the retirement home. The first true modern Call of Duty on the Wii was Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare Reflex Edition. A mouthful, I know, but they were just letting you know what you were getting into. Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare, 2 years after it released on a worse console. Old Jimmy was already playing the sequel. Now, a lot of people online swear by this control scheme, using the nunchuck and Wiimote. Maybe not for me. I can use little gyro assistants like with Splatoon, but still. At the end of the day, this was just the same as the 360 version, but with worse graphics. A pretty impressive feat, and perfect for the kiddos craving the duty without having to beg their parents to splurge on a new console. There was even multiplayer. That includes servers being up all the way into 2023. I have no idea who was out there playing this online in the 2020s, but hey, good on them for keeping it up for so long. Moving ahead a bit, a ton of AAA games from the 8th generation jump suffered from ports, things that were sent straight into the frame rate dimension, never to return. However, Tango Gameworks' The Evil Within did not. This horror cult classic directed by Shinji Mikami ran perfectly fine on the PlayStation 3, basically the exact same game. Good job. Titanfall 1 had a similar path. The porting legends over at Bluepoint took this Source Engine ran title and slapped it onto aging hardware and made it work. According to an interview with Eurogamer, they had to replace certain aspects of the engine in order to get it running, and it doesn't look as good, but most people aren't going to be able to tell. Well, until you had to interact with the ancient 360 hard drive and GUI. I don't think the standard 20 gig hard drive is going to hold it. Finally, Wolfenstein's second reboot of the generation, The New Order, is a modern classic. During a time when most first-person shooters were skimping out on the single player in favor of multiplayer only, this bad boy smashed through the door with a 12-hour-long campaign and threw that online in the trash. The gall of machine games. Thankfully, it was both critically and commercially successful, and it still runs great on older hardware, only really dipping when a dumb amount of guns are firing on the screen. Around this time, we were slowly starting to favor good PC ports again, so to see something like this pull it off without much of a difference at all is great. It's just Wolfenstein, with a side of long loading times, icky textures, and if you're on the 360, 4 full discs for installation. Which means The New Order joins the ranks of LA Noire and Lost Odyssey, a very exclusive club. Now for the opposite. What happens when a dev tries to squeeze out all the juice of an old console they can and they can't quite make it work? Well, you get the bad ports, which means Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 4 for the PlayStation 1. That's well over 2 years after the PS2. If there was a will, there was a way, and somehow the PlayStation 1 found a way. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 4 ain't your classic style THPS. It's the first time they threw an open-ended mission structure into the mix, having you interact with NPCs and get info dumped dumb problems that only you can solve with the power of sick tricks. Sometimes funny, other times dated, but usually fully voice acted, even if they weren't professionals.
What? My partner's in trouble. Somebody's got to help him. Don't just stand there, do something.
It's fun. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 4 is fun. Big freaking surprise here. I like my Hawk with a 2-minute timer, but still, I guess we're gonna be seeing this in a few months in HD though. However, what happens if you take that game, strip out a majority of what I just said and slap it back in an older engine? What you get is Pro Skater 4, but worse in every way. It's bad, even if they did their best to call back to the originals. The frame rates are abysmal, it's a common trend here. That and the levels were clearly not meant for the weightier movement. The PlayStation 1 sure had a hard time rendering these more hilly stages. The texture warping's off the charts. Skating through one of these areas for a single minute gives you the impression that they've cut out a lot. Entire chunks are missing, and it feels like they ripped the 4 out of Skater 4. NPCs? Non-existent, just giant tokens that allow you to play goals. Turns out Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 5's giant lifeless parks were an homage. Usually Vicarious Visions does a bang-up job with these types of ports, including on the Game Boy Advance, but unfortunately, this time wasn't enough. Burnout Legends is a port and maybe demake of the awesome Burnout 3 Takedown, and it does a great job of maintaining that on Sony's old nut machine.
It's like a nut.
Yearly checkup for your PSP battery. Legends was a lot of fun while sitting on the school bus. However, what happens when you take this port/demake and then port it to an even weaker console? Burnout Legends on the Nintendo DS. Oh my god. Okay, maybe we're skirting the rules a bit considering the PlayStation Portable and DS were technically adjacent gens, but the hardware differences are so vast. The rare occasions where we'd get a release on both usually gave us devastating results. Developed by Visual Impact, who've done a bunch of portable demakes, Burnout Legends ain't it. If playing the PSP version was like Hot Wheels, this one's like a great value brand. And it kind of looks like it too. Look at these 20 beautiful polygons. I kind of dig them actually. Would love to see D. Craig's face in this engine. The problem is, it just plays horribly. You've got a weird swerve whenever you turn that feels janky, and the camera follows suit. It looks bizarre. Listen, there's a ton of other DS racers out there like Asphalt, Need for Speed, or heck, even Mario Kart DS. And again, with those, you don't get crash mode with its 4 cars. If this was your first exposure to Burnout, I feel sorry for you. Hello Mercs 2, we just talked about you. Let's do it again, but for the PlayStation 2. Developed by A2M, the people behind Dead by Snoopy's Great Adventure. How do you take a PlayStation 3 game, slap it on the PlayStation 2, and have it run? Easy, you slap it in the first game's engine. Tony Hawk learned them well. I'm gonna be repeating myself here. The frame rate's terrible. It's so freaking blurry. It's like I'm running that adaptive resolution in Xenoblade 2, but the color palette looks like a hodgepodge of negative saturation. Top it off, we got the N64 fog, though it's pretty funny to see things pop in rapidly while flying. Thankfully, it's still got a lot of fun stuff in the open world. It's not bad, just well, the differences are stark. Saint? Wait, one more bad port. It's a game that a lot of people don't like in the first place. Watch Dogs. This was a huge deal during the pre-release marketing, so much so that it's led to a massive distrust from E3 style game trailers. I'm not sure if this technically qualifies as previous gen, but I'm gonna say it anyway. Despite coming out on PC, PS3, 4, 360, and the Bone, the worst version of Watch Dogs is on the Wii U, and it's not even close. Heck, they even missed the launch window with it coming out in November of 2014, 2 full years after that console hit store shelves. All hype gone, the game already ripped apart by gamers and press, and on a console with a massive gimmick that not many people bought. Watch Dogs for the Wii U in its barely 20 FPS glory. Somehow this thing ran even worse than the 360 and PS3 versions, and that's impressive. I was willing to give the benefit of the doubt, thinking it was potentially running 2 instances of the game because of the gamepad, but no, it's just a basic map. At least when it isn't yelling at you to look at the TV. It's a massive shame too, because Watch Dogs does have some fun and interesting moments. It just requires the frames to not shit the bed, causing inputs to start lagging while you're trying to escape the police, and it feels terrible. The audio sounds like it was compressed to high hell, like a 3DS or Vita port, but this was on a disc with 25 gigabyte capacity. It got graphically axed, even in comparison to the PlayStation 3. It's so jagged looking. We got flickering, texture pop in, the freaking works, to where it feels like I'm playing some knockoff iPad GTA clone. I guess at some point, Ubisoft just cut their losses with the Wii U, didn't attempt to clean up the port, and just threw it out into the wild months after the hype train. Wii U gamers deserved better. I should know because I waited in line overnight in the cold to get one. I didn't need to, no one showed up, but Sonic All-Stars Racing Transformed sure was good. Now that's a decent port. It supports 5 players. Yo, how many Wii U exclusives do we got left? Asterisk, good ones. Nintendo Land, I guess? Because no one cares about Amiibo Festival.
It feels great to bring the whole family together.
One last game for the day, and I think it's something a ton of people care about. Terrible timing on my part, but we're about to talk about Monolith Productions, a studio that just got shuttered by Warner Brothers. Easily one of the biggest casualties in recent memory, and a stupid decision. Turns out making a fantastic game will also get your studio shuttered. But before they were gone, they were responsible for 2 of the most noteworthy Tolkien and Lord of the Rings licensed games out there, Middle-earth: Shadow of Mordor. Lord of the Rings and Hobbit video games have been around almost as long as Super Mario, and we've never been on short supply. Seriously, when you look at just the PlayStation 2 and onwards, there's been about 40 some odd video game releases in just 25 years. That's a lot. So many that someone should cover them all one day. Not me though, that's too much. And then I'd have to play Naughty Dog's Lord of the Rings. Maybe not. We've had a ton of good ones like the movie tie-ins. I think me and 10 people love War in the North. And then there's stinkers like Gollum and Aragorn's Quest. But there really was nothing quite like Shadow of Mordor for the PlayStation 3. Shadow of Mordor is, without any hesitation, a pretty freaking good game, even if my editor doesn't think so. It's a marriage of Assassin's Creed with Arkham combat that came together with the Middle-earth license to give me something that was just a blast to play and run around in. It has this dark and oppressive atmosphere, easily one of the most contrasting differences between it and the other Frodoian counterparts. All of this is sewn together with the ever-popular, always mentioned, Warner Brothers pre-discovery patented trademark Nemesis system. You play as Talion, who gets killed after watching his own family get killed, decides, man, I really hate orcs, teams up with the wraith of an elf, and goes full murder hawk on hierarchies full of orcs. Ones with weaknesses to exploit, fun stealth gameplay opportunities, and more shit talking than you can imagine.
You're not quite so fearsome in the flesh. Rotting, fetid flesh, I might add.
Or you'd fail and they get promoted up the ranks. It's Nemesis because the orcs you slay and get slaughtered by remember you, how you killed their buddies, and they'll try to buff themselves up to prevent it from happening again. Maybe it's a bit archaic by 2025 standards, but the execution back then was astonishing. Shadow of Mordor is a great early showcase of the power that the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One could pump out. Then enter Warner Brothers again. They weren't content patenting mechanics, they wanted that big last gen bag of money, meaning yes, it's time for the power of the cell. 2 consoles with 1/16 the RAM and over 8 years of technical differences. Porting this was gonna be a toughie. So tough, they'd come out 2 months later. The result? Yeah, that's about what I expected. Maybe this should have stayed in the vault. I mean, look, it's great that people who can't afford newer consoles would get the opportunity to embark on the Tolkien-inspired quest for revenge, but this has gotta be one of the crunchiest looking games I've ever seen. Textures popping in all over the place, including in the menu. Y'all like polygons? Here's a few. The sheer amount of nonsense on screen is wild. Almost like a console with half a gig of RAM can't and shouldn't run this. The greasy, bloomy Vaseline look at the 7th generation of consoles always, well, was a look, but it's never been worse than this. PS2 would have exploded, like for real. Listen to this bad boy. It's like a jet engine. We got screen tearing, audio stuttering, 13 frames a second, and don't forget compressed audio. It's truly a technical marvel that Monolith was able to get this running on hardware created in 2005, but running this poorly during combat just ain't it. Good luck doing any counters or parries when you're playing what amounts to a slideshow of mud and swords. Good luck remembering any information you got from the pause menu because it takes 10+ seconds to load back in every time. All of the cutscenes are ugly renders of the PlayStation 4 versions, and that makes transitions like stealth kissing your wife at the beginning super jarring. And to top it all off, remember how I was just glazing the Nemesis system, the defining feature brought up in every review from now till the end of time? Well, in order to get this thing to run at all, they just took it out. Like, it's just gone, non-existent. Sure, there's still orcs to fight who are named, but the whole Nemesis part of the name simply doesn't happen. There's not a changing hierarchy. People aren't coming for revenge. There's just a bunch of dummies with 0 object permanence, like my cats. It's a huge shame because this system single-handedly keeps the combat from getting too stale, and its absence leaves us with a game that frankly shouldn't exist. This one's gone a bit under the radar. It's hard to find any proper review publications tackling this port. It's an oddity that at this point is one of the last bastions of a long-lost era. The last gen port doesn't happen nearly as much these days outside of third-party Switch releases, and seeing something so drastically different is probably never gonna be a mainstay of gaming ever again. I do recommend you try Shadow of Mordor, just not this version. Seriously, my PlayStation 3 is about to explode. Someone help. Help! So, there you have it. The lost era of last generation video game ports and enough jank for anyone to shake a stick at. There's obviously gonna be way too many of these to keep track of, so I decided to stick with the more notable ones and hopefully I got most of them. Let me know some more down in the comments. Also, if you liked today's video, check out the sponsor, Carmen Sandiego. If you'd like to support us directly, head on over to the Patreon where you can join our backers, gain access to the Discord, and help us keep the ball rolling. Buy a t-shirt over at the Pixel Empire, and I know you've all heard this before, but gotta do the thing. Anyways, for now, I'm gonna hit the sack. I've been Austin, and this is the last video before we touch base with the Justice League, which means, yes, the next time you see me, I'll be having full brain rot. Thank you all so much for watching. Special Patreon shout out to Alfred Correa, Benna Oswald, Blackfoot Ferret, Blake Thomas, Charles Rosner, Cheeks, Clerk Fox, Chris Shelton, DX Buster, Dylan Snyder, Fragile Traveler, Hey Quiggles, Idlevice, Jay Roos, Jacoby Fitzpatrick, Kevin Zanowski, Pierre, Platinum Rose, Pacha Bear, Rare Find It, Ryan Talbert, and Vox. Thank you all so much for your generous support. And hey, big shout out to Joshy for helping me put this one together. This is a topic I've thought about for a long time, and being able to go back and look at some of these games firsthand really shows a lot. With the new Switch on the horizon, I don't know if we're ever gonna get something like this again, so hey, appreciate it while you can. For now, I'm gonna go to bed. Goodbye.